half a century ago, we turned on the first head-mounted display. Now, my role in this committee is to tell you about what brought up that. How did that happen? Why did it happen? What was the backstory? I'm going to start my story in 1948. I was 10 years old. I was a student at the Edgewood Elementary School in Scarsdale, New York. The school provided textbooks. We didn't have to buy them, but we were expected to cover them to keep them clean. And of course, my schoolmates all had very fancy covers from Columbia, from Princeton, from Penn, and other Ivy League schools. Even elementary schools in Scarsdale already had high ambitions for college. Now, my mother argued that our family couldn't afford the cost of such fancy covers. Fortunately, my father was a civil engineer and he had blueprints, big blueprints, that would make terrific book covers. So they got cut up and my book covers were all blue and they had white marks on them. And those white marks represented objects that my father had designed. He was a civil engineer. His life work was taming the Snake River in Idaho. Now, when I was bored, I used to try and figure out what do these white lines on my books mean. And with some help from Dad, I learned how to read blueprints almost before I could read English, certainly before I could write English. Of course, the blueprints were orthographic projections, and so I had to mentally figure out what the shapes meant. And some of the shapes were pretty complicated. The water from a dam goes down through a penstock, which is basically a big pipe, and then it turns some corners and goes into a scroll case, which is a thing that looks like a snail that goes around the turbine, so the water goes into the turbine uniformly from all sides. And figuring out what that was in 3 dimensions was pretty tricky business. I wished I could look at it in other ways. It was not until years later that I took a formal course in engineering drawing at Carnegie Tech, and I knew how to read engineering drawings, but now I had to make them. And I pretty much hated that, and you probably know that that's how Sketchpad came about. Well, while I was at ARPA, or maybe just after, I visited the Bell Helicopter Company in Fort Worth, Texas. And they were trying to figure out how to help helicopter pilots land in narrow clearings at night. And so they mounted an infrared camera underneath the helicopter, and they attached it to the pilot's equipment that he wore on his head, which had some prisms in front so he could see it. When the pilot turned his head, the camera turned in synchrony with the pilot's head. And that seemed like a pretty clever idea. Now, my big contribution to the head-mounted display project was to recognize that we were just repeating what Bell Helicopter had done. But instead of a camera, we could substitute a computer. And that replacement allowed us to view a mathematical world of our own choosing. We could see anything we wanted from any angle, and that would make it easy to understand complicated shapes. It was an answer to my boyhood prayer. I could figure out how a penstock could connect to a scroll case. It would seem to me like the most obvious possible thing to do. And I knew it would work because Bell Helicopter had done some important psychological experiments with the head-mounted display. I think the best one was the subject was sitting in an office building in a comfortable chair with his equipment on his head. And when he turned his head, the camera, which was on the roof, turned its camera around too. And he was watching 2 people play catch on the roof. And he would turn his head so he could see, as the ball went back and forth, to see how the players were doing. And then one of the players threw the ball at the camera, and the subject ducked. And so it was clear that from his point of view, he was at the camera and not sitting in a comfortable office chair. And it was clear that we could have a presence in this strange world that we would create from the computer.